I've had both shots.
Yeah, I have too. But I went down and went ahead and got mine that day, and then I got the second one later after I had shingles. So I've had the shot, shingles, and another shot.
Well, it's no fun. I agree.
Yes.
So what?
Hi, Renhan.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Great, thank you.
Nice to see you on Zoom.
I'm Renhan, Jane. Hi.
I'm Ruth Wheaton. I know it says Robert Wheaton, but we share the computer, so
I understand.
sometimes his name always comes up.
Only the three of us?
So, well,
there should be somebody.
Should be somebody else.
Yeah, somebody else was signed up. I can't remember who it was. How long is this program? Do you know?
Supposed to be an hour.
An hour?
Mhm.
Okay, good.
They usually leave time for questions at the end.
I'll be right back.
Barbara is on.
Now, this says this meeting is being live streamed. Do you know what that means?
That means as she speaks, we are what's that? It happens as she's speaking.
Oh, okay. Oh, I see. All right. Oh, Barbara Humphries. Hi, Barbara.
Hi, Barbara.
Hi.
Oh,
Hi,
nice.
good afternoon.
Hi, Bradley.
Well, hello, Bradley.
How's everyone doing?
Good.
Good, it's good to see you. Dana is off today, so she asked if I'd be able to facilitate today's lecture. So hopefully I've got it all set up correctly, and we'll go ahead and get it started here in just a moment. Just want to let you know that this presentation is also being shown on TLG TV, the in-house TV channel as well. So there's likely more people joining that may just be watching on their television. So thank you for joining, and bear with me just a moment and I'll get the lecture started. I'm looking forward to it. It's gonna be a good one.
Hello, I'm Mike Parker Pearson. I'm a professor of later British prehistory at the Institute of Archaeology at University London. And I've been researching Stonehenge for, well, 20 years. And in that time, we've really revolutionized, I think, what we know about this mysterious monument. Now, what does everybody know about Stonehenge? And I think everyone knows about Druids, because there's a whole religion in the UK, people who actually see Stonehenge as the temple of their ancient order. Now, the whole Druid religion, the current one, started really just less than a couple of hundred years ago, but it developed out of it one of the earliest theories of Stonehenge, that it had been built by Druids because it dated to before the Roman period. Now, of course, this was back in the 17th century when this theory was put together, and it was thought that, all we knew about prehistory was what had been written down by Julius Caesar, writing about his invasion of Britain. But of course, Caesar was thousands of years after Stonehenge, and those earliest antiquarians, as we call them, like William Stukeley, had no idea that it was so much older, but it stuck, and the theory has sparked a new religion in that form. Another a theory that came shortly, well, not so long ago in the 1960s, was developed by the American astronomer Gerald Hawkins, who published a book that really grabbed the popular imagination because he used a new type of technology, a computer. And of course, in those days, computers were as big as houses. But he used a computer to say that essentially Stonehenge was a computer to be able to work out astronomical predictions such as solar and lunar eclipses. Now, while some of his work was definitely solid, the rest of it hasn't really stood the test of time. And astronomers today really take a more minimalist view. One of the key things we know about Stonehenge is that its main axis, for example, is towards midsummer sunrise. That's towards the northeast. And then 180 degrees, in other words, in the opposite direction, that is towards midwinter sunset, the two of the key solstice directions. There are also people who think that Stonehenge could not possibly have been built, but could have been built up by humans. And I just share with you part of a letter I received after one of my TV documentaries. Dear Professor, I enjoyed your TV program last night. However, I must conclude that the circular footprint of a spacecraft determined the outer stone circle and the landing tracks, the basis for the avenue that of course leads out on the solstice alignment. Such views tending not to be so prominent these days. And I think a lot of this developed out of another of those 1960s writers, the Swiss fraudster Erich von Daniken, with his famous book Chariots of the Gods. But my own direction for Stonehenge came from a slightly unexpected quarter. And this was because back in the 1990s, I was working in Madagascar with a wonderful archaeologist, Ramili Sonino, and we were researching megaliths in Madagascar, where it's a living tradition. People build them today. And it was when I invited him to come to Stonehenge in 1998, so just over 20 years ago, that he just looked at me and said, "What do you mean you don't know what it's for? It's surely obvious. Have you learned nothing working with me in Madagascar?" Because very simply, in Madagascar, stone monuments, megalithic tombs and standing stones are put up for the ancestors. So they're often places of burial. And even if people are not actually buried there, they commemorate or they even represent or they even embody the actual dead themselves. And he said, of course, in contrast, in Madagascar, wood is transient. It's not permanent like stone. So wood is associated with the living, that we build our houses, he said, traditionally out of wood, because, of course, they don't last. Life is short. And that set up an idea that maybe Stonehenge, built as a circle in stone, could actually be contrasted with a group of circles upstream built out of timber, one of them Woodhenge. Now, of course, the wood has long disappeared, but we could tell from the post holes that are left that these had been wooden circles. And this set up an idea that maybe Stonehenge was part of a larger complex divided into two. So a domain of the living upstream at Woodhenge and the Great Henge of Darrington Walls, and then downstream, approached by the avenue, the stone circle for the ancestors and the dead. And we published this theory straight away in '98. And by 2003, I was so intrigued about the possibilities that we set out a series of predictions that I thought we could test these by actual excavation. And that's what we set out to do. And really, we've been doing ever since. And these are the projects that have made that possible. I won't go through them in detail. The key thing was an excavation, a series of excavations at the beginning, the Stonehenge Riverside project. We then looked at the resourcing of Stonehenge. What had people needed to build it? Where had they come from? And then the project we're really still involved at the moment is, where did the stones come from and why? Now, for those who aren't specialists in British prehistory, Stonehenge occupies the period that I've marked in red here. It's the transition from the end of the Stone Age to the beginning of the Bronze Age. And it covers a very short period of time that we're calling the Copper Age. And the first stage of Stonehenge, in what we call the late Neolithic, comes 1,000 years after farmers arrived in Britain to bring agriculture with them, replacing millennia of life, which was hunting and gathering, the period that we call the Mesolithic. Those hunter-gatherers, we've learned a lot about them recently through the study of ancient DNA. And perhaps to everyone's surprise, it turns out that they were dark or black-skinned. They even seem to have had there's a preference for blue eyes. This is the most famous. This is Cheddar Man, whose whole genome was reconstructed very recently. But we know that in other parts of Europe, these Western hunter-gatherers, Western European hunter-gatherers, all have these similar genetic traits. And they're very different to the Neolithic farmers. But first of all, let's look at the Mesolithic imprint in the Stonehenge landscape, because there's evidence that possibly the Stonehenge landscape was really quite important thousands of years before Stonehenge was built, in the time of those Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. First of all, down by the river at a site called Blick Mead, and you can see on the screen here, marked by a red circle, recent excavations by another team have found that there was a large and long-lived Mesolithic settlement. And then up within a couple of hundred yards of Stonehenge, 600 feet from Stonehenge, a group of Mesolithic pits that held large timber posts. Here's the Blick Mead settlement, some photographs during excavation. And what's been really interesting is that the radiocarbon dates show almost continuous activity on that site. Probably not people living there permanently, but coming back and forth, maybe seasonally, maybe periodically for decades at a time. But it's unusual because of the many Mesolithic settlement sites we have in Britain and Ireland. None of them have this kind of longevity of use. The posts at Stonehenge, these are the pictures of the post holes themselves, and they're not quite unique, but it's very rare to find such monuments in Britain, or indeed anywhere else in Europe, built by hunter-gatherers. We normally associate monument building with early farmers. What these posts were for, we don't know. It looks like they may have been put up at different times, but potentially these could be something similar to Northwest Coast American totem poles. When the Neolithic farmers arrived, their background was ultimately in the Middle East and Anatolia, the area that is today modern Turkey. And we know that from the genetics, looking at Neolithic skeletons, is that the farmers who arrived in Britain, their ancestry came, we can trace back to Anatolia and the Middle East via the Mediterranean. So they're a southern group as opposed to those that came up the Danube and into Northern Europe. So the dark brown as opposed to the orange arrows in this map. And we know that the genetic makeup of the farmers of Britain most closely mirrors those from Iberia, Spain and Portugal, down in the bottom left of our picture. And they largely replace the hunter-gatherers in Britain. There's a 90% genetic replacement of them, very little interaction, so it seems. And quite possibly within 200 years of their arrival, around 4000 BC, that those hunter-gatherers had pretty well died out. Moving back to the Stonehenge landscape, it is full of monuments today, dating from different periods in prehistory, but some of those date to before Stonehenge. So north of it, there are two monuments called cursuses, the greater cursus and the lesser cursus. These were built about 500 years before Stonehenge's first stage, around 3,500. There's a map where we're showing an inset of that area, and you can see that the cursus inside the square there. But I've shown this because this shows all the Neolithic tombs in this area that we call Salisbury Plain around Stonehenge. And what it shows is that that Stonehenge area where the two cursus monuments are was already special for the early farmers hundreds of years before Stonehenge, because it's here that they built. We have the densest concentration of Neolithic tombs anywhere in Britain. We call them long barrows because they're long mounds of earth. We also have the cursuses, and the two red dots mark what we call causewayed enclosures. These are large enclosures surrounded by ditches, which were used for large-scale gathering and feasting. So there was already this particular part of Salisbury Plain was already a sacred place, and as I said, quite possibly having its origins among the in the Mesolithic period for those previous hunter-gatherers. And then as we approach the period of Stonehenge itself, we see that within this particular landscape, there's a large number of these henges or ring ditch circles. And these date to the 3 or 4 centuries immediately before Stonehenge. And as you can see, these are the black circles. And there's more of these than we have at any other similar ceremonial complex in Britain, because we find these kinds of centres in many different places. But Stonehenge, even before they built Stonehenge, that part of Salisbury Plain, was clearly more special than anywhere else. And when they build Stonehenge, it's not the big circle of stones that we see at the center of this photograph. It starts off with the ditch and bank that you can see around the edges there. That is built in the 30th century BC, and we can date it by radiocarbon to between 3000 and 2920 BC. Not only that, just inside the bank itself, there's a group of 56 pits that are known as Aubrey hulls, named after John Aubrey, one of the early antiquarians that was interested in Stonehenge. And we were lucky enough to excavate one of these in 2008, or I should say re-excavate it, because it had already been dug into by previous archaeologists 80 years before. So we know that that first structure had stones in those Aubrey hulls, and then the center of the monument was filled with holes for posts. And we think that these formed a series of rectangular timber structures. Where they built Stonehenge has turned out to be at the end of a very unusual feature. It is, of course, today marked by the Stonehenge Avenue that runs out from Stonehenge northwest on towards the midsummer sunrise. But we realized that its ditches were cut against the sides of 2 natural ridges, and that within those ridges were a series of parallel gullies. All of these, the ridges and the gullies, are actually natural features formed in a previous ice age. So it's quite clear that they took an existing natural landform, which by coincidence was aligned on that solstitial axis, and they stuck Stonehenge at the southwest end of it. So in other words, it looks as though they were well aware of this special natural feature in the land, And maybe this was a significant part of their cosmology, the way they thought about the world, that they saw this as something special, maybe where the earth and the heavens were in some kind of cosmic harmony. It may also have set the spirit, the sense of a spirit of the place for Stonehenge, because the monuments around it, Stonehenge is one of 8 that have solstitial orientations. And unlike any of the other monument complexes within Britain or Ireland, that is unparalleled. 1 or 2 monuments in different parts of the country have such solstitial orientations, but to find 8 in one particular landscape is utterly unknown elsewhere. Now, one of the tasks we wanted to find out, a reason we called our project the Riverside Project, was we wanted to see what happened at the riverside. Was there an avenue linking the timber circles at Darrington Walls and Woodhenge to the river? And did the Stonehenge Avenue also reach the river? And if so, what happened at that point? Because according to Rami Sonina's theory, the river should be the connecting conduit between the living and the dead. And not only did we find those two avenues, but we also discovered that at the beginning of the avenue leading to Stonehenge, there were remains of another stone circle, Blue Stonehenge, because of the Welsh bluestones that had once been put up in it, although they had all been dismantled and taken away, we think, to Stonehenge sometime later in the sequence. The other interesting aspect of Stonehenge's discoveries was that it had been not just a cemetery, but the biggest cemetery in Britain in the 3rd millennium BC. We estimate that quite possibly over 200 people had been buried there. We've excavated ourselves nearly 60 of them, because when we dug into that Aubrey hole that I showed you a photo of earlier, here it is in the lower right, we knew that those early excavators had buried all of the human bones that they found in the early years of excavation between 1919 and 1926. They buried them there in 1935, not from any religious reasons, just because they couldn't think where better to put them, because it seems that no museums at the time were interested in a heap of cremated bone. But of course, we now know a lot more about how to analyze cremated bone than people did then. And we found out some really interesting things. We've been able to radiocarbon date them to discover that the cemetery was used for about 500 years from the very start of Stonehenge, and that burials were spread all over the monument, particularly around the edges in the ditch, inside the ditch. Also, very unusually, they are mostly adult women. There are very few children at all, and it seems unusual to have quite so many women, and certainly if we compare it to the first period of the Neolithic, the earliest phase of those Neolithic farmers, they normally have more men than women. So this is different. We also know, though, that for monuments elsewhere in Britain, there's a preference for women to be buried in monuments. So we may be looking at some kind of kinship structure, power structure, where women had a much more significant position than we'd ever guessed at. And I've said in bracket at the bottom there, where are the chiefs? Because there's very little differentiation between any of these burials. There were very few grave goods to really suggest, whether we've got any chiefs among them. And it's been one of the running issues of Stonehenge. Everyone's wanted to find chiefs building such a great edifice, but all of the evidence seems to really suggest otherwise. The second stage is when it broadly took the form that we see Stonehenge in today. So that's when the great big stones went up. And the, the blue stones that had been in the Aubrey holes, much smaller ones from Wales, I'll talk more about them in a moment, they're arranged within the two great settings of what we call sarsens. Sarsen is a local type of sandstone, a silcrete for any of you geologists. And they're put up with they're shaped, and also they have lintels on the tops of them. So we have a sarsen circle around the outside, and then a horseshoe of what are known as trilithons. So a trilithon is basically two uprights and a lintel on top. So there are 5 of those trilithons forming a horseshoe open to the north, east, and the solstice sunrise. And in fact, the great trilithon in the southwest, although it's fallen now, its opening underneath the lintel basically framed the direction of midwinter solstice sunset. At the same time as this stage 2, around 2500 BC, the wooden circles go up at Darrington Walls and Woodhenge. And you can see there in the top right, I've marked that site with an arrow. It's also a settlement at that point, and then the settlement is replaced by a huge timber circle, more than 300 large posts around its perimeter, and then the posts were removed and a henge ditch and bank, so a ditch in black, the bank in white, erected. And we can date that also fairly precisely to somewhere around 2470 BC from radiocarbon. Now, this strange idea that you put the ditch inside of the bank as if you're trying to keep something in rather than out, this is what archaeologists call a henge. Now, by that definition, Stonehenge itself, which has the ditch on the outside and the bank on the inside, is not technically a henge, even though that's where we get the very word henge from. And ultimately, it derives from the Old English for hanging, possibly because medieval and earlier folk thought of Stonehenge as a kind of stone version of a gallows. Underneath the bank of the henge, we found evidence for what had once been a huge settlement. And you can see here in the photograph on the left, there I am standing amongst the remains of the house floors. And you can see that they're off-white, they're chalk plaster floors. They had sunken circular fireplaces in the middle of them. And then all of that dark material that they're set into, that is Neolithic filth. That is trash built up over the less than 45 years of occupation of that settlement. And they would have been knee deep in it. It's now condensed down to a layer that's about 6 inches deep. But it was packed with debris, pottery, animal bones, flint tools, rocks from cooking, from heating and boiling water, all sorts of things. And we've had some interesting reconstructions done, as you can see in the photographs. They're very small buildings. They're really not much more than about 15 feet by 15 feet. So here's a reconstruction of the sort of settlement that it might have looked like. And I think this would have been really very substantial, potentially as many as 1,000 houses and for as many as 4,000 people. But given that this is pretty much the same date as the building of the second stage of Stonehenge, my guess is that this is where the builders' camp actually had been set, so that this is where they would have lived for a very short time. In radiocarbon terms, we know it's less than 45 years. From the replastering of the floors, if that was an annual act, we've got up to 8 years of use in each of those houses. So it's possible that we're looking at no more than a decade that people came here to get involved with constructing Stonehenge and, of course, constructing the timber circles at Darrington Walls. And I think it's also worth remembering that for those Neolithic people, the wooden circles, we've got 3 of them, the so-called Northern Circle, and near the top of this picture, the Southern Circle in the center of the picture, and then Woodhenge to the south, that these would all have looked amazingly impressive, far bigger than Stonehenge itself. That in a way, Darrington Walls would have been the real focus for people at that time. Here's a reconstruction that we were able to put up while we were doing our excavations. And they all have solstitial orientations. So the Southern Circle, instead of facing the midsummer sunrise, it faces the midwinter sunrise. And it's got an avenue which is aligned in the opposite direction towards midsummer sunset. So you would approach, if you approached up midsummer, you'd be looking up that avenue towards the Southern Circle, for example. So it was realizing how important the solstice was, both midsummer and midwinter, for this particular monument complex within Britain. As I said earlier, it makes it quite remarkable. Some of you will have heard of Avebury, the largest stone circle in Britain, which is about 20 miles to the north. And that has no astronomical, solar or lunar orientations whatsoever. So it seems that each monument complex had its own particular theme, as I said, a spirit of the place. The Great Stone Circle, the Great Timber Circle at Darrington Walls, what's 440 meters? That's something that's over 1,500 feet across. So this was put up as the village was going out of use, and it would soon itself be replaced by a great henge ditch and bank. I've marked that henge ditch and bank here in the map in blue, where it says Darrington Walls. And a recent discovery that's really shaken us all, I think, is that around its perimeter, which are marked in yellow, there's a group of what are enormous pits, up to 20 meters across, 5 meters deep, where some of these have been cored. And these have been discovered as a result of geophysical and ground radar survey. The coring has grabbed some samples from the bottoms of the fills, and it looks like they're built after the settlement of Darrington Walls went out of use and after the ditch and bank of the henge had been constructed. So if you've got a good memory, that earlier slide, that falls within what we call the Copper Age, the transition really between the end of the Stone Age and the beginning of the Bronze Age. Some people aren't so sure. They think that these are just solution hollows that are fortuitously arranged in a circle outside of Darrington Walls. I think that's a little too much to believe. I'm pretty sure that these have to have been humanly constructed. But it gives some idea of the massiveness of the project that the Stonehenge landscape meant for people of prehistoric Britain. The other interesting thing was realizing that Rami Ilison's idea of a domain of the living, actually, we found it. We found its perimeter marked by the circuit of huge pits. And excavations that have taken place in their vicinity reveal that they actually follow the line of what seems to have been an enormous fence of large posts, which date to the time of the village. So there's a sense that there's a zone where the people of the settlement hung out at, the Darrington Walls settlement. And then when we look over to Stonehenge itself, we've got a rather curious pattern coming up from the distribution of finds as well as monuments, which is that Stonehenge seems to have sat within an empty zone. I've called it an empty quarter, an area where virtually no debris got dumped or dropped at any point between the Neolithic and the Bronze Age. So it seems that Stonehenge was in a kind of clean area that was avoided in terms of all the activities of daily life that might be happening at different points within that Stonehenge landscape. So it suggests to me that we do indeed have a special zone, Ramilson's domain of the ancestors. Looking at Darrington Wool's settlement itself, what's been really interesting is the evidence that people in general were not there all year round, because we see a peak in the killing of pigs between their first autumn and first winter. And you can see from the graph at the bottom, the bar chart there, that although there's culling of animals, culling of pigs all year round, there's a particular peak so basically in 9 months after they're born, and they're born in the spring. So it looks as though we've got a major feasting moment in the Neolithic calendar, that people were coming to Darrington Wools in largest numbers and doing most of their feasting at that particular time of the year, basically around the winter solstice. And those animals, we know, are coming from many different parts of Britain. And we can do this through strontium isotope analysis, not just of the pig's teeth, but also of the teeth of the cattle. Most of the animals feasted on were pigs, 90%, whereas nearly 10%, most of the rest of the 10% were cattle. And we know that they were coming not just from the chalklands. So that's in the graph there on the left, that's the values between 0.708 and 0.711, but they're also, so 708 and 709, but they're also coming from the green zone. So again, you've only got to go 20 miles away from Stonehenge to land up on that sort of geology, marked green on the map there. But some other ones are coming from further away. And we now think that those may well be coming from Wales, amongst other places. And Wales does seem to have been particularly important, because those first stones at Stonehenge were, as far as we can tell, blue stones. And they're nowhere near as big as those Sarsens, but they're up to 3 3/4 tons. And that's a fair old weight, as you can imagine, to drag 170 miles all the way from their quarries in southwest Wales. Not so far for the Sarsens, brought in stage 2 rather than stage 1, but they're really big. They go up to about 35 tons. They don't start until 4 tons, which is the average weight of the lintels. But they, as we now know, only had to come from about 15 miles away to the north. Let's take a look at that aspect. So they're associated with the second stage, as I said earlier. I've marked them here on the plan in grey. And geologists have only last year tracked them down to a place called West Woods, 15 miles north of Stonehenge. And we've speculated on various routes. I think the most likely one is the one with the dashed line, passing through these other Neolithic sites of Knapp Hill and Marden on their way down to Stonehenge. So a tremendous feat in its own right. But it's the Welsh ones I've been particularly interested in. It's an enormous distance. And of course, they are there at the very beginning of Stonehenge. So they have to be ultimately wrapped up with the very purpose of the monument when it started off as a place of burial for all those cremated remains. And what we know is that although they're given the generic term bluestones, they actually form there are actually different types of rock. So there's dolerite. In America, it's known as diorite. There's rhyolite, another igneous rock, and there are other kinds of volcanic rocks, as well as sandstone. And our brilliant geologists, Rob and Richard, have actually identified, in some cases, the specific sources of some of these stones. Here's one of them. This is where one of the types of rhyolite at Stonehenge come from. It's called Craig Roosevelt, and it's a spectacular outcrop at the foot of the Preseli Hills on the north side of that range. And it was here, marked by the red arrow, that they were able to pinpoint one of the rhyolites at Stonehenge, not just to the outcrop, but actually to the very spot it was lifted out from. Because at that point, we actually have a recess where a pillar has been removed. And right next to it, the sampling point that they took to do their analysis. Further up the north slope of the Preseli Hills is another of the sources of the diorite, the spotted dolerite, as it's called. It's a diorite with white feldspar spots in it. And likewise, we know that the quarrying here also happened in the centuries before that first stage of Stonehenge, and indeed right up to the very period itself of the blue stones appearing at Stonehenge. Looking at the context for these quarries, and we've marked Craig Roosevelt and Carn Goydog here, we know the source of another type of dolerite without spots at that place called Cerrig Machoggian in the center of the map here. But we've known for a while that this wasn't some kind of empty place within Neolithic Britain. This was actually somewhere really quite special, a major Neolithic ceremonial complex in its own right. It has these wonderful monuments that we call dolmens, like the one in the picture there, that's called Penta Ivan. And you can see that although this dates to around 3700 BC, 700 years before the Bluestones went to Stonehenge, they'd already got the idea of putting a lintel type stone, a capstone, up on top of standing stones. But what we wanted to know was, whilst dolmens date to before the Stonehenge period, what was going on immediately before the Bluestones were dragged to Stonehenge? What was happening here in this region that it was so important to take them that outrageously distant on that outrageously distant trek all the way to Salisbury Plain? And we know that there are enclosures, causewayed enclosure in the south there, but what really caught our eye was that there was a partial stone circle just 3 miles from the known quarries, right in the center of this complex. There is a photograph of it with our initial excavations. It's called Wine Mound, and just 4 of its stones are left. Only one of them still standing, the other 3 have fallen over. But where were all the others? Why is it just an arc of stones? Was it actually a much larger stone circle? And that's what we've been investigating recently. So on this marked, the black and red dots are the extant stones. And what we did was, by extending the excavations, I should just say we tried all sorts of geophysics, and they just didn't work on this very difficult glacial soil. But what we discovered was that there were holes continuing around that arc, which also had once held standing stones. And in the top one, in the top left photograph there, you can see where the large stone, the standing stone, had been pulled out on the right-hand side, but they'd left the packing stones on the left-hand side that they jammed in to the pit that it was standing in to make sure that it stood up. Here's another one in the central picture. And what we discovered is that we had another dozen or so of these holes which had held standing stones. But, and we've literally just found this out this autumn with our excavations, the monument was never finished. There's a point along the east side where they actually dug pits to hold stones, but never put them up. So they must have abandoned it in mid-construction. We can date the period of construction somewhere between 3,400 and 3,200 BC, so a couple of hundred years or so before Stonehenge itself. So it looks as though the stones didn't actually leave from the Preseli area until some centuries after this circle was abandoned. And my guess is that the missing stones, the dozen or so that got taken away, that's where they went to. It was a big stone circle as well, 110 meters, so that's what, 350 feet in diameter, the third largest stone circle in Britain. There's another interesting thing. When we overlaid the plan, we saw that it was exactly the same diameter as the ditch from the first stage of Stonehenge. So they're the only two monuments that I know of in Britain that happen to have a diameter of 110 meters. It also shares with Stonehenge that interest in the midsummer solstice sunrise, because we know where the entrance is, and our astronomer has plotted out where the sun rose at this particular time in prehistory. And you can see that it rises basically where the left side of the entrance is. And we also found that they started off by marking it out, that entrance, with wooden posts. So somebody must have sat in the center saying left a bit, right a bit on a solstice morning, while somebody banged in a wooden post so they could say, this is where we want to put the entrance stones. And then you've got the massive journey around 3000 BC. Archaeologists used to think that they went by sea, taken off the top of the Preseli Hills down to the coast, and then along the coast, either slung between boats or on rafts. That's the solid line. I'm less convinced about that because the quarries and the circle are actually on the north side of the Preseli Hills. And in fact, there's a much more straightforward journey by land, following a natural routeway, which has actually got a major road that runs along there today, because of course it's the obvious way in and out of South Wales. So I think that's maybe another possibility. And also, I think it's a key thing to bear in mind is everything we know about megalith building. It's all about excess and muscle power. It's about showing off and feasting. And that's something that you can really do with a land project, rather than riskily sending your kamikaze Neolithic sailors out carrying 2 and 3 ton rocks. So that would be my guess. This is all about spectacle, and it's all about unity, bringing people together, literally pulling together. So what better than to have something that would bring everybody in from all around to take part or just to watch what was going on. Secondly, why? Why on earth do something like this? And the two things I can think of is that they're actually conquered by the people of Salisbury Plain, saying, "Oh, you know, we've not only bashed up their stone circles, stopped them finishing, but now we're going to have their rocks." Well, that's a possibility. Another idea that we're looking at is maybe actually it's bringing two different centers, power structures, two different territories together in some kind of unification. And the other intriguing aspect that we're wondering about is that after 3000 BC, our ceremonial complex in the Preseli Hills just seems to end. There's no trace really of anybody very much still living there. So maybe there was a migration. That's another theory that we're investigating. We've got students to pull replicas of these stones. And actually, well, we were able to do this with just 20 students, to drag a a block of stone, well over a ton. And I think also realizing that they don't use rollers, you use timber rather like rails. So if the stones are set on wooden sledges, you're basically dragging them off along relatively low friction rails of timber. So you're picking them up from behind and putting them in front as teams drag them along. And I think there would have been no shortage of labor to take place, because this would have been like the moonshot for Neolithic Britons. This would have been the most amazing thing that had ever happened, and everybody would have wanted to come and see what was going on.
One-day university.
One of the reasons that I think it may have been some kind of migration is that when we look at the isotopes of the people buried at Stonehenge, there's a certain proportion. We've only looked at 25, but 4 of those 25, they grew up somewhere well away from the chalklands of Salisbury Plain. And in fact, their isotope values of strontium are consistent with West Wales, so where the bluestones come from. Not only that, they're among the very first people to be buried at Stonehenge. So they could actually be people who came with the stones. And then after that, everyone else buried at Stonehenge has what we would call local signatures that you'd find in the Stonehenge area. So quite possibly that's evidence that they came with the stones rather than it being a straightforward conquest by the people of Salisbury Plain. What's going on in terms of Britain's identity and who was who in different parts of the country? We know from ancient DNA that the East and the West were quite different genetically. It's not an absolute difference, it's one that's quite graded, but basically people in Wales, they had their origins in continental Europe from somewhere different to those that were living in Eastern England. And Stonehenge is kind of plonked right down in the middle between these two particular types of genetic, these two types of genome. And archaeologists have wondered also independently whether we've got those early farmers colonizing Britain from two directions. One lot coming from Brittany, this is in with the yellow marker, the yellow arrows, and starting in places like West Wales and moving up into Ireland and northern Britain. And then another lot marked by the red arrows coming on the short route from basically Calais to Dover. And that maybe that accounts for why we have these differences. And perhaps one of the purposes of Stonehenge, built 1,000 years later, was to actually unite these different tribes or whatever they might have been. So maybe Stonehenge was some kind of unification of the different ancestries of farmers. And for those earlier farmers, we can see that regionalism because marked in green and in yellow is where we find the different styles of pottery. The red dot is Stonehenge right in the middle. And of course, that whole business with the natural ridges and grooves, might that have been seen as what anthropologists call an axis mundi, the center of the earth, the axis of the world, that they saw as being somewhere that was in between the territories, what they would call a liminal zone between different groups, different tribes. So that's one possibility. And then the second stage, when it goes mega with the huge Sarsens, maybe they're restating that unity. Because one of the things that's really quite intriguing is within 100 years of that, we have a complete culture and population change in Britain with the arrival of new people and new technology, metal, copper and gold, coming from continental Europe. And we know from the genetics that they're what we call a steppe-derived or steppe-related ancestry. So their original ancestors are actually from the Pontic steppe. That's the zone between the Black Sea and the Caspian. And we know that they ultimately replaced by 90% the genetic ancestry of the Neolithic farmers in Britain. So in other words, looking at this graph, this is the proportions from skeletons through time. So from the beginning of the Beaker people, as we call them, we can see how much the red dominates the blue. And the red is the steppe-derived ancestry from Europe. And the blue is the amount of Neolithic ancestry that they've picked up from after arrival in Britain. And you can see that it basically levels out that within 1,000 years, they've only got about 10% of that initial British Neolithic population's genes in them. So it's a large-scale replacement that took at least 16 generations. There are continuities, though. They're still building monuments and stone circles, and they're still largely pastoralist, but the later stages of Stonehenge are really quite minor messings around with the blue stone circles. So very finally, what was the context of doing all this? And I was wondering initially, is it all about the good times? You build these in a boom time when you've got lots of people, you've got huge amounts of surplus, long distance trade and exchange to shore up your society. The picture looks very different to that. It looks like we're dealing with a time of population decline, when the forests are growing back over the fields. There's a decline in cereal cultivation, and they're cutting themselves off from Europe. And of course, all that changed when these Beaker people arrived. And that's it. Thank you very much. And I look forward to your questions. Do ask, even if you feel it sounds silly. I'm sure it won't be. So we're looking forward to what you have to ask. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for your questions. And I've got a list here to answer. I'll start with Sue, who asks, is there an archaeological connection between Stonehenge and Avebury? As I'm sure you know, they're 18 miles apart. Avebury's to the north, and they're one of 5 monument complexes from this period that run kind of north to south from the River Thames to the south coast. The other ones are Marden and Knowlton and Dorchester. And they are the largest henges anywhere in Britain. One of the things that's kind of been intriguing us really is whether they almost form a kind of a boundary zone between East and West, something that I talked a bit about in the presentation, and that they may well have fulfilled similar functions of bringing large numbers of people together from different sides of the hill, from the east and the west, as it were. We know also from the the isotopes on cattle teeth at Avebury that those animals, like Stonehenge, are coming from a long way away. We've got some quite good dating evidence for the relationship between the two sites, so that we know that when Avebury was turned into a henge, so around the stone circle, that was the very moment that everybody was living in the great settlement at Darrington Walls. And quite possibly it was the same people who may have taken part in digging out the huge ditch at Avebury. And it's a monster. You know, the Darrington Walls ditch is 5.5 meters deep. Avebury's double that. So it would have been a huge amount of work. So people have suggested that maybe they were in competition. Maybe these were rival ritual and ceremonial centers, or of course they were simply being utilized at different times for different reasons. And that's a question we haven't really resolved. If I can move on to Robert's question about the bones at Stonehenge, he asked, perhaps it was sacrificed for any number of reasons. And there's certainly one burial at Stonehenge which might well fit that bill. And it's the very last one in the entire sequence of burials in the 3rd millennium BC, because it's the one that is an inhumation. So not a cremation and not a disarticulated group of bones. It's a man who was shot with 3 arrows from different directions, from 2 sides and from behind. And it's been suggested that he could have been sacrificed. On the other hand, he could be someone who was assassinated even. And his grave is pretty rough and ready. He's just been pitched into the side of the surrounding circular ditch without too much effort to dig the grave in question. But I think for the cremation burials, it's the fact that the structure of burial is like we see throughout Britain for this time, not just for everyone buried in monuments, but also burials that are out in the countryside at that time without any necessary monument and association. We know that there's a preponderance of adult females that receive this cremation burial, and there are often grave goods as well. And so I think what we're seeing at Stonehenge is just part of a wider normal burial rite. So for the cremation practices that seem to have been pretty regular throughout the island at that time. Moving on now to Mark, do I see any type of connection between Stonehenge and Newgrange in Ireland? And of course, Newgrange is famous because on the solstice at midwinter, the rising sun shines straight through through a light box positioned above the passage, so that those first rays of the sun hit the back of the chamber. And it's really one of the very earliest indications in Britain, sorry, I say Ireland, but Britain and Ireland, because of where we actually see the solstice being an important feature associated with the dead. We know, for example, if we go to Orkney and the great tomb of Maes Howe, which is another passage grave like Newgrange, that the solstice at midwinter is also significant. If we go to North Wales, the passage there is aligned so that it's at the so it's the solstice at midsummer that's important in that particular case. And I think one of the crucial things here is that it's these early passage graves, and they date to around 3,400 BC. So they're a few centuries before the first stage of Stonehenge, that they're really demonstrating this link between the ancestors and these key moments of the sun's movement, these solstice positions when the sun is at its most extreme at the shortest and longest days. Now, I think what's been really interesting is looking at the relationship between Ireland and Wessex with what's happening in West Wales and our site at Waun Mawn, which has a solstice orientation for its entrance, because of course it's halfway between the two complexes, and the passage grave culture, if we want to call it that, in Ireland and Scotland and other parts of Western Britain, such as the island of Anglesey in North Wales, is very different in its architectural and illustrative forms. So there's this very distinctive passage grave art or passage tomb art with all these spirals and zigzags and other interesting abstract motifs. But it doesn't really translate into the mainland of Britain. And it's very interesting that a site like Waun Mawn, which is one of the very earliest stone circles in Britain, if not the earliest, happens to be in that kind of zone between the passage grave art tradition and the Stonehenge and the henge tradition in mainland Britain. So yeah, I wonder if the idea about the solstice marking, both at Waun Mawn and then at Stonehenge, really owes this to the passage grave traditions in the west of the British Isles. Then someone's asked, how were the stones transported? Was the wheel already in use? Were they rolled over logs? And of course, there's no real way of knowing the answer to this, but one of my research students, Barney Harris, has been looking into this in some detail for his PhD. And first of all, as far as we can tell, the wheel in Western Europe is not something, it's already there in places like the Netherlands before the very beginning of Stonehenge, probably by only a century or so. But it looks as though Britain really kept itself isolated from the continent. And we don't actually have any evidence for the wheel until the Bronze Age, until about 1500 BC, hugely later than this. But my suspicion is that the wheel doesn't really appear until we see the arrival of those beaker people that bring metallurgy, the working of copper and gold, with them when they largely replace the Neolithic population of Britain. So if there's no wheel, how do you do it? And there are all sorts of exhibitions and books that tell us about using logs as rollers. You place them underneath a sledge and you pull the sledge and the logs roll along. There have been experiments with this, and they've discovered it doesn't work very well because unless your logs are all machine tooled to precisely the right circumference and don't have any bits sticking out, unless they're perfect, the logs will just jam. They will bump into each other and you'll maybe covered a couple of feet, but you're not going to do any more than that. They're really no good for any long distance movement. And what Barney Harris, my student, was able to do was to actually do an experiment with our students where they laid them horizontally, but he said we could also have laid them transversely in the direction of the pulling of the stones. And then you basically slide the sledge over these stationary logs, rather like rails. And what he then did was to look at the ethnographic evidence, so places like Madagascar, where I've worked, but also places in Indonesia, like the island of Sumba, and also the archaeological record, because in Egypt and Mesopotamia, we've actually got representations, carvings and paintings, which show hundreds of men pulling large statues. And in all of these instances, that's the method you use. They're not rollers, they're rails. And in Egypt, for example, there's a tomb image which shows men standing at the front, in front of the wooden sledge on which the statue is sitting, and they've got jars of some kind of liquid that they're pouring in front of them onto the wooden rails, so in order to lubricate and to minimize the friction. So I think we can we can surmise, we can speculate that actually the simplest way to do it is to use logs as rails, because that's the way that modern and ancient societies, where we have the evidence that that's the way that they did it. Question from Kerry. Today, are people able to walk among the stones, or is it roped off? The answer's yes to both of those. For ordinary opening times, say between 9 o'clock and 5 o'clock, thereabouts, the stones are roped off and nobody can go within the roped off area. But it's possible to get a special out of hours ticket. It's really quite expensive. I'm not sure how much it costs today, but it's a lot of money. You normally basically have to book it as a group. So you're paying hundreds of pounds for your group, which may not be more than about 20 people or so. and you're allowed to go into the stones out of hours. The key thing that English Heritage, who take care of it for the nation, are concerned about is that Stonehenge is there to be photographed by anyone and everybody without people walking around inside of it, so that you can get a photo of the monument clear and pristine, as it were. And that's the compromise that has been employed now, I think probably since the 1970s. Next question, how was the top horizontal stone put in place? So we're talking about the lintels being raised on top of the sarsens that form the outer circle, and also that form each of the 5 trilithons in the inner horseshoe. And the simple answer is, well, we don't know. There were some interesting experiments carried out in the 1990s when an engineer and an archaeologist got together, and with a TV company that funded it, and hundreds of volunteers, and they tried 2 basic methods. And one of them was to construct a wooden cradle, and you basically jack up each side of the cradle, one after the other, so that it raises the lintel to the height of the uprights, and then you jack it so that you can slide the lintel into position. And of course, it's tricky because you have to remember that the uprights have got tenons, these little knobbly bits, which the mortise holes in the bottom of the lintel have got to fit into. So it's quite a challenge to do that. The other possibility is that this could have been done with some kind of ramp, maybe made out of soil or chalk, and you simply build a great ramp, and then you pull the lintel up the ramp and onto the top, and then you just move the soil away so that it comes down to rest with those mortise holes on top of those sticking up tenons. That certainly seems to have been the method that was used 700 or so years earlier in Wales, when they built the dolmens and raised the capstones up on top of those dolmen tombs. If we go to somewhere like Sumba, that I mentioned earlier in Indonesia, a similar process with dolmens and their capstones is done with scaffolding. It looks incredibly flimsy. I'm sure it wouldn't pass health and safety regulations here in the UK, but that's the way that people have done it. So there we are. Have we got any more questions? No, I think that's probably it, everybody. Hopefully I've answered everything you wanted to know. But I've got a little message here that says, that's it, time's up, unfortunately. But thanks very much for tuning in to the talk, and I really hope you've enjoyed it.